I am Zach Braff, and I am the star of the new show Alex Inc., and I'm one of the executive producers, and I directed a whole bunch of them. And this is...
I'm Matt Tarse. I created Alex Inc., and I'm an executive producer on the show as well.
Awesome. And so my first question is, what drew you to tell this story based on Alex Bloomberg's life, and why tell it now?
I think that the podcast was really riveting, and I think I really related to the story. I love the show Shark Tank, and I love watching all those families come in there and pitch their American dream. And to me, this was a wonderful articulation of all of those stresses that they go through, the highs, the lows, the fights, the successes. And the interesting thing was that the thing he was selling was that he was an amazing storyteller. And I thought, wow, you could do voiceover that leads into the actual podcast. And I just thought it was fascinating. And now podcasts are all over the place, and it felt like a really relevant thing to be a new business that's on a TV show. Matt?
Well, I think you said so much, there's almost nothing left to say.
Well, you could say that I did a good job.
You did fine. I felt like there was something, because I agree with almost all of that, but there was also something about hearing Alex Bloomberg's voice that reminded me so much of Zach's voice and the way he used to do the voiceover in Scrubs. It felt like you would tell this great story about the American dream, about trying to do something that felt, maybe a little bit out of your reach, but you went for it anyway. You have this great voiceover element because he's making a podcast in the show. And it felt like the right time. His life felt similar in some ways to my life, similar to Zach's life. It just felt like a cool confluence of events.
Yeah.
And even though the show is based on a real person and a real podcast, how much creative freedom did you have to explore your character and the other characters in the show?
Well, we really used it as a jumping off point. I mean, we want to tell, especially the fans of the podcast, that don't come looking for the exact thing at all. I mean, we were using it as a jumping off point. It's really inspired by the podcast because as genius as the podcast is and was, it's not a half-hour family comedy that we were trying to make. So we sort of used things we loved. There's that amazing moment in the first episode of the podcast where he's pitching horribly to Chris Sacca, the self-made billionaire, and it's so awkward and uncomfortable. And we were like, well, for example, that we have to put in the show, and actually ask Chris to play himself. So that's an example of something that's little touchstone moments we put in the show, but we took a lot of artistic license. Is that what you say?
Yeah, that's something you say. Yeah, I couldn't have put it better than that. He said it right.
Okay, nailed it.
What can viewers expect for this first season? Will it mirror the podcast in terms of what it discusses, or what can viewers expect?
I think there's a few moments from the podcast that we sort of used, but I think it's pretty much it pretty much go like Zach said. I think we go sort of our own way. It's about the struggle of building a company in the early parts. It's a lot more about how that struggle impacts a family than the podcast, because I think that's really the main way we sort of diverged, was by really, it becomes a show about, this guy who's thrust his family into this kind of critical moment and how that creates comedy and conflict. And so that's what you see in the first season, is this sort of, can we survive this, in a funny way.
Yes.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you. How did I do holding the mic?
Fantastic.
I nailed it. It reminds me of when I used to be on that show on MTV, TRL. I was on TRL. Google it.